Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Elizabeth Egley. I'm the Senior Director of Institutional Giving here at SBP. I'm happy to be your MC today and excited to welcome today's speakers. Thomas Corley, SBP's Chief Operating Officer, will briefly share an overview of SBP and the goals of this call. We're going to bat out of order a little bit. Matt Arlen, Chief Recovery Officer for North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, will share a brief message about the state's recovery priorities. You will then hear from two SBP team members, Josh and Angela, who will share our observations and recommendations for government, community, and individual recovery efforts. Then Dr. Chris Emmerich will spend some time digging into preliminary unmet needs assessment. We will reserve the last 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, so please ask your questions in the chat as we go, and we will answer them at the end. Thomas, I will pass it to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks for all of you who are spending some time with us today. We have just over 30 individuals with us today, representing a variety of nonprofits, local government, foundations, businesses. We're really, really grateful for your time. As Elizabeth shared, my name is Thomas. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at SBP. And for the last 13 years, I've helped SBP expand and scale our disaster recovery operations. For 20 years now, SBP has been helping to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. We simply help get people home after disasters. To date, we've rebuilt close to 7,000 homes across the country. We've hosted 150,000 volunteers, trained thousands of community members and leaders, and all along the way, we've shared best practices and helped communities recover and prepare. In our experience, across the dozen of communities that we have helped recover, it takes on average 5 years to get 90% of people back into their homes following a disaster like Hurricane Helene. Now, since September, SBP has been listening to North Carolinians. We've been running analysis, deploying teams, really seeking to understand how SBP can best support recovery from this unprecedented disaster. We've done quite a bit. We have filed a number of FEMA appeals. We've been mucking and getting homes in Western North Carolina. We've been leading teams and organizing for a Regional Recovery Acceleration Week, which you'll hear more about, and SBP will be hosting next week in partnership with the Housing Assistance Corporation in Hendersonville. But some of the most important work that we have done is organize and execute an initial assessment of the damages and the road ahead in Western North Carolina. We're going to share those perspectives with you today. You're going to hear from a variety of experts, both those on the SBP team and our partners. And our intent on this call, which is really consistent with SBP's intentions in supporting long-term recovery in Western North Carolina, is to offer perspectives and be additive to local efforts. What we know, though, is that more than anything, in disaster recovery, predictability matters. And so as we step into this, I want to offer a few points of framing. We want you to walk away with really 3 things following this call. First is we want you to know that we're here for you and know that SBP can do things today to help. We're already doing this, as I just shared, but SBP is actively working to determine the best, most community-centric way we can be involved in long-term recovery in Western North Carolina. Second, we come with experience and a sincere desire to pay that forward. We're not claiming to know it all or know it best, but we do feel deeply compelled to share as much knowledge and perspective as we can to shrink that time of recovery in Western North Carolina. The third, and I share this collective perspective from SBP, we are deeply inspired and energized by the strength of the community fabric in Western North Carolina. It is that fabric, that locking of arms across nonprofit, and government, and business, and funders that will permit both healing and points of beauty to emerge in the months and the years ahead. Families will return home, neighborhoods will be restored, and many of the people on this call today, they're going to be to thank for that. So without further delay, I'm really pleased to introduce Matt Arlen, the Chief Recovery Officer, North Carolina's Office of Recovery and Resiliency, just to share a bit more about the state's perspective on Helene. Matt, let me pass it to you.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you all for, again, joining us here today. It's my great pleasure to be here with you and just say a little bit about NCORE and the state's perspective on the ongoing long-term recovery from Hurricane Helene. I am the Chief Recovery Officer for the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, and it's my goal to make sure that we set up the frameworks and strategies we need for you all to be able to succeed in the challenging times to come. My heart really goes out to you all who are impacted yourselves and still taking this opportunity to do the difficult and necessary work to help your neighbors while you yourselves are looking for answers and guidance on what comes next. This can feel like the hardest part. There's confusion and uncertainty about what the future holds for you and for your communities, for your loved ones and your neighbors, and what are the next steps that you're going to have to take. You're very fortunate to have the good people at SBP here to share their incredible base of knowledge with you. They've been an invaluable partner to NCORE, and if you listen closely, they will help you get on the right path. NCORE is also here to help you get on the right path. And there's been lots of questions about the role NCORE and the state of North Carolina is going to take in support of the long-term recovery in Western North Carolina. And so what I'm here to say to you and explain to you today is that we are preparing a long-term housing recovery plan powered by community development block grant, disaster recovery funds, and potentially some state funds. And we have some experience with disaster in the state of North Carolina, as many here know, but there is a lot to learn and a lot to adapt for the unique challenges in Western North Carolina. You're going to learn today a lot about the best practices on how to survive this very difficult part of your long-term recovery journey. And this transition from your immediate emergency needs to your growing list of mid to long-term needs. And so what has the state learned already? What we've learned already is that the renter and rental support issue is immense in this disaster. And the need for affordable housing is going to be some element of our long-term recovery plan in a way that we haven't had to do at the scale we may have to do in this instance. We also know that there's a call for economic in revitalization and economic programs like grants and loans. There are going to be funds available for that in some state programs, but the region has been dealt a devastating blow in peak tourism season, and damage to the service industry is incredible. And a lot of that is not going to be able to be satisfactorily answered in the long term. And so we have to develop a good strategy on how we're going to reinforce and support that damage in the future. Of course, there's going to be substantial homeowner recovery. And the ethos that NCORE is going to proceed under is a strong basis of self-direction from the recovering homeowner, a strong sense of simplicity, and an ease of access to participation in the programs that are going to be coming. And so what is the state doing now? Right now, it's the time for the state to listen, to hear from you what you need, what your worries are, and what you fear will be overlooked. That listening is going to be critical as we put together an action plan together that is going to best serve your needs. From there, we intend to design programs that meet your needs and continue to evolve as new needs are identified. Thank you so much, and please, if there are any questions, drop them in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them at NCORE, as I'm sure the folks at SBP will be happy to answer them for you too. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Chris, who will begin his part of the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'll be providing you with a summary on a variety of topics, starting with a brief intro of myself and my colleague, Dr. Jean Longenecker, a summary impact assessment highlighting key aspects of what we know about FEMA applicants and the impacts to housing, the concept and utility of social vulnerability analysis, and how combining social vulnerability and impacts can be used to support an effective and effectively apolitical recovery for disaster survivors across the impact zone. Time will be reserved for questions at the end, but also feel free to put questions into the chat as we work through the following slides. In a nutshell, I'm best described as a practical academic. I've not always been in academia. Rather, it's been a pleasure for me to spend time in the public sector, the private sector, and the government sector, learning about the processes and challenges and helping to shape a better future for disaster survivors. In essence, unlike many pure academics, I've built a career around attempting to support EM decision-making, focusing on the most vulnerable and marginalized in our society, and looking at past disasters to improve outcomes for future disasters. Likewise, my colleague, Dr. Gene Longenecker, a postdoctoral scholar who works with me here at UCF, also has varied background, mainly as a physical scientist with FEMA, but also as a researcher attempting to build better models for floodplain mapping and risk and vulnerability and resilience assessments. In a previous life, Dr. Gene headed up FEMA's modeling task force, where he brought science and technology to support critical response decision-making. In this briefing, Dr. Gene built the slides related to the physical hazards themselves that led to the disaster in North Carolina, and I focused my efforts more on the impacts from those hazards. To start, let's take a moment to consider what North Carolina has dealt with and continues to deal with in the ongoing disaster. In thinking about what happened, I want to recognize that there are at least 4 main hazards or challenges that have coalesced to create a catastrophe. Over the next few slides, we'll touch on some of the differences between federal flood products and the more recent science products that we use to understand flooding and how these have been part of the disaster. We will review the history of flooding in the region and talk about how pre-Helene rainfall alone would have caused a disaster on its own even before Helene plussed up the disaster. And then, although we will not talk about it due to time constraints today, I wanted to highlight that more than 2,000 landslides have occurred across the region, each bringing with it a local disaster of its own, and recognize, as many of you know, that all disasters are local. Finally, we will touch on the ongoing water disaster that has, and begin to think about how this complicates an already slow recovery process. Let's jump in, shall we? On the left, you will see a map of FEMA's official regulatory 100-year flood zones in Swannanoa. And on the right, you'll see a similar map showing a very different flood zone extent. What does regulatory mean? Simply put, it establishes where development practices and building codes are governed by a different set of rules and helps inform us of where flood insurance is required, among many other things. It's important to recognize that because FEMA flood mapping efforts do not account for headwaters, in places like North Carolina, the flood extents are potentially very different than a representation of 100-year flood zones, which account for headwaters, that map on the right. In short, the flood maps driving laws around building in flood zones are underestimating risk in the area. As you can see, if you look at the red, the burnt orange, and the gray circles on each map, there are vast areas that FEMA does not recognize as flood zones that for all intents and purposes should be governed by more strict regulations. Decisions that have been made based on these FEMA underestimations may have put more homes, businesses, and government buildings at greater risk during the recent disaster. A similar map of Chimney Rock provides us another example of these differences between what we think are risky areas and what are truly at risk from flooding. An unfortunate reality that many North Carolinians continue to be reminded of as we respond to and recover from Helene's devastation. No one can argue that there is a long history of flooding across the region. And as you can see from the table on the left, which is sorted by historic crests in the area, about every 5 years or so on average, there have been flood events that break records. Note that at the top of this list, the 23-foot crest of 1916. More than 100 years ago, a very similar disaster took place in nearly the exact same place. Like the current disaster, in late June and early July of 2016, an unnamed storm coming from the Gulf of Mexico stalled and dumped buckets of rainfall in the region. Does that sound familiar? Certainly does to me. As that storm dissipated, another unnamed hurricane making landfall in South Carolina made its way inland to the Asheville area, unleashing an extreme deluge, unlike any we've seen in modern memory until this year. What we know for sure is that forecasts have come a long way since 1916, and we all knew that massive amounts of rainfall were expected in North Carolina prior to Hurricane. The map on the left, we can see what was expected in terms of pre-Helene rainfall. The fact remains that this area, like many mountainous areas, typically sees moisture coming from north to south, rather than from south to north. When these fronts hit the mountains, a process called orographic lifting causes rainfall to happen on the western side of the mountains, leaving the eastern sides typically drier. However, this type of rainfall and weather coming from the south, like we saw in 1916 and again with Helene, which is atypical, was certainly unexpected by many. As you can see from the map on the right, this pre-event rainfall from the south met and was carried north by the jet stream, where it was cut off by a low pressure system to the west, and then hemmed in by another low pressure system to the north and a high pressure system to the east. This combination of atmospheric conditions resulted in North Carolina's, I'm going to say, quote unquote, rocky top being really the ground zero for all the rainfall. Next, please. Without that hurricane rainfall, North Carolina was already in for a wild ride in terms of flooding from the pre-event rainfall. If you look at the image on the left, we can see the pre-Helene that appears on the forecast hydrograph for the French Broad River in Asheville suggested a minimum peak of about 16.5 feet as of September 26th. This amount of rainfall would have produced moderate flooding on its own. So there was going to be a flood disaster with or without Helene. However, that added precipitation from Helene then led to record catastrophic flooding thereafter. One of the images, the one on the right from the monitoring camera at the stream gauge on the French Broad at Asheville, recorded some of the high water conditions, but not the peak of the flow due to equipment failure of the extreme conditions. The monitoring camera was actually replaced or repaired, put back into service on October 10th, revealing some of the ongoing debris accumulated along that Pearson Bridge Road. USGS stream gauge hydrograph showed a provisional flood of 24.67 feet, far surpassing that 1916 flood event on the French Broad River in Asheville. Thus, it was the combination of this pre-event rainfall and the Helene rainfall, coupled with our really incomplete understanding of the true flood risk in the area, that all combined to create the current catastrophe. As if that was not enough, beyond absolute devastation along the rivers, another disaster was unfolding that you are probably continuing to deal with. The first image here shows an angler holding a trout caught at the North Fork Reservoir. I'm sure this is very familiar to everyone. Note the typical water color of the reservoir, clean, clear, and perfect for recreational fishing, and the tourism dollars associated with it. Fast forward to after Helene, and you can see a recent image from the North Fork Reservoir. This cloudy tan water is not only unsafe for human consumption, but also makes it difficult for fish to breathe or to forage for food. In fact, during the historic flooding, the turbidity of the French Broad was above 500. That means 500 times the safe drinking standard when the monitor stopped reporting at the French Broad. Note, though, that by October 10th, if you could click again, please, when the sensor was restored, the turbidity in the French Broad had already returned to pre-flood levels. That meant the French Broad was clean and clear again. The same cannot be said for the North Fork Reservoir, though. which as recently as November 4th still had turbidity 18 times greater than the threshold for safe drinking water. In combination, this lack of accurate understanding of the flood risks, the pre-event rains, and the Helene rainfall associated with floods, landslides, high winds, and tornadoes, which we didn't even talk about at all came together to create this ongoing catastrophe that has led to damages we are just beginning to quantify. Over the next few slides, we'll take a shallow dive into impact accounting. It's important to note that the federal partners, FEMA, HUD, and others, as well as almost anyone interested in impacts, use FEMA data to describe losses. It's critical to understand because this is actually really critical to understand, because if disaster survivors are not registered in the FEMA system, they will not be accounted for, not only by FEMA, but by almost everyone that comes after them. As we look at what FEMA data can show us, we will start to build an understanding of the most impacted areas. And this term most impacted is really important. It's a HUD term utilized to describe areas based on damage, FEMA damage specifically. As promised earlier, we will take a look at social vulnerability and touch on its utility for understanding who is most distressed. Another HUD term you will hear a lot about when it comes to CDBG-DR allocations that are made to help North Carolina recover, hopefully in the future. Finally, we'll see how combining these data sets can provide a useful approach for understanding where the most impacted and distressed areas of the region are. Next, this map shows registrants to FEMA's individual assistance program as a ratio to housing units in each county. Here you will see this swath of brown from Transylvania to Cleveland counties, north to Avery, that have the highest applicant rates. It's important to note here that most other disasters never reach 50% of applicants. So having 20% at this time is roughly in line with what we see with other disasters. It's even more important to note that we should be encouraging everyone who has had damage to apply, even if they know that they do not qualify. Why? Because if FEMA does not account for them, no one else down the line will account for them either. Although FEMA data can give us a sense of spatial patterns, it can also paint more than a pretty picture. And although a picture is worth 1,000 words, I would like to share some summary stats with you about how this disaster recovery process is unfolding. This table shows that FEMA's perspective on Helene's impact. Remember that FEMA is an applicant-based program. You have to be registered to be recognized. To date, we have nearly 250,000 applicants, 247,000 applicants. However, less than 25% of these applicants have been inspected. We see this in the second row. This is not abnormal, as it takes inspectors time. On average, about 5 to 6 houses per inspector per day, typically. So the inspection process is ongoing. However, of the 58,000 completed inspections, only 16,089 were found to have real property housing damage. This is also not surprising to me, and we will hear more about the FEMA appeals process and the unfortunate need to appeal it in a bit. It is important to note here also that FEMA does not inspect for damage to rental dwellings. This bears repeating because it's something that I'm digging into in other work and really plays out in disaster recovery because it has implications for some of the most distressed survivors. Renter applicants to the FEMA program and rental applicant dwellings are never captured in FEMA data. If you're interested, we can talk more offline about the implications this has for disaster recovery. Of the 16,089 survivors with real property or housing loss, the average loss, according to FEMA, is $11,477. This is a bit higher than other disasters I've been involved in. And honestly, I presume this value will actually decrease as inspections increase across the area. Finally, note that nearly 20% of applicants are over age 65 and more than 81% are considered low to moderate income. That is, people and families earning less than 80% of the area median income. These are target populations for many disaster recovery programs and should be explored more in the near future. With that basic idea about how FEMA sees damage, let's take a quick look at what FEMA is doing to support recovery. In the right table, we see a summary of FEMA's approvals for home repairs and replacement, as well as personal property assistance. Let me first start by recognizing that FEMA by mandate is not ever going to make someone whole. Their mission is making housing units safe and sanitary, not to support full recovery. Hence, FEMA support will always be lower than any sane person thinks or any other disaster professional knows to be true. Here we see that of the 16,089 applicants with FEMA verified losses, only 8,400 have been approved for repair and replacement support, with an average value of assistance of $6,500. That leaves nearly 240,000 disaster survivors waiting for FEMA to show up and provide any kind of repair assistance. Furthermore, less than 6,000 have been approved for FEMA personal property assistance supporting replacing things, not structures that are lost. Here, the average support for personal property is just over 2,500. Like the other values, I believe this average will decrease, but that the number of people receiving assistance will increase when everything is said and done. Back to the pretty picture. Here we see a different perspective on damage. This map at the zip code level shows a more precise representation on where damages are currently greater. Caution should be taken when looking at this map due to the following caveats. First, you saw on the previous slide, FEMA inspections are really just getting underway. With only 23% of inspections complete, I would expect this map to look much different in the coming days and weeks. Second, FEMA's application period is still open, and I suspect that we will see another 50,000 plus applicants over the coming weeks. Finally, damage values alone do not tell the whole story. This map does not differentiate between 10 houses with $100,000 in damage or one house with $1 million in damages. Yet, it's useful for us to start to understand differential impacts, and when combined with other data, can be very helpful for recovery program development. Stepping away from damages for a moment, I wanted to take just a beat to share the concept of social vulnerability with you. Full disclosure here, I've been working on the science of vulnerability science for about 20 years and have really strong feelings about the different social vulnerability measures that are available out in the wild. It's worth noting that all social vulnerability measures are not equal and that each one has the potential to produce drastically different portraits of the landscape and the social vulnerability across the landscape. If you're interested in learning more about those differences, we can talk offline. However, social vulnerability broadly refers to the set of socioeconomic or demographic characteristics of a person or a community that lead to a lower ability to prepare for, respond to, or rebound from disasters or other shocks and stresses. Built from disaster case study literature, a set of over 30 characteristics collected for any area in the US and Puerto Rico, representing different population features known to decrease an individual's capacity, can be loaded into a system for any area and processed to determine what is quote unquote driving vulnerability, known here as SOVI. It's important to recognize that social vulnerability manifests itself differently in every place. For some, social vulnerability comes from a lack of education, coupled perhaps with low English proficiency and living in a mobile home. For others, social vulnerability may be a combination of a lack of access to automobile and primary sector employment, while for others, it may simply be a function of age and income. When SOVI is computed for any area, the outputs include a table showing the overall drivers of vulnerability for that specific area, and that's what we see here. Across the impact area, SOVI for the declared zip codes is mainly driven by wealth, as you see on the left-hand side here, aging populations, higher numbers of renters, lack of access to automobiles, housing cost burden, which is the percentage of the population spending more than 40% of their income on housing costs, unemployment, educational attainment, and others. You can see from the dominant variable list on the right that there can be a combination of any of these things, some happening all at once and others occurring singularly to create social vulnerability. SOVI can also be presented as a map, and although the table is more telling for the data geeks, including me, the map is equally important for creating a spatial depiction. I'm sure that each of you now is focusing on a county that you may be familiar with, or simply looking at those areas that we highlighted in previous maps to gain some perspective. I think what's important to note here is just because a specific zip code might have low social vulnerability doesn't mean like the zip codes in southern Buncombe or northern Henderson County does not mean that everyone living in those zip codes has low vulnerability. Likewise, everyone living in a medium vulnerability county, like portions of Haywood County, does not have medium social vulnerability. Remember that vulnerability is dynamically manifested differently for each place. Just as disasters are local, social vulnerability is place-based. Recognizing that the SOVI measure is built on a long history of disaster case study literature and sound empirical science, it's an important step in considering that it can be coupled with what we know about disaster impacts to create a targeting mechanism. In fact, former Governor Nikki Haley believed so much in this apolitical approach to using science to support disaster recovery in South Carolina that she supported the use of SOVI to build the quickest disaster recovery program ever seen by HUD. Again, talk to me or the folks at SBP about those details later if you're interested in learning more. In any case, when we put SOVI together with damages, we can really begin to understand where it might be smart to target recovery programs for the most societal benefit. On this next slide, we can see a bivariate map of social vulnerability and real property losses for the presidentially declared counties in central and western North Carolina. On this map, one can easily see where social vulnerability is high and losses are low, the dark red areas. Where disaster losses are high and social vulnerability is low, the light blue areas. Or where social vulnerability and disaster losses are both high, the dark burgundy areas. Click one time, please. Oh, sorry, back one time. Sorry about that. Because none of us have unlimited funds to support disaster recovery, we think that this sort of targeting is the first step towards supporting recovery for the right people in the right places and for the right reasons. Now we can go to the next one. Taking a step further, we can dive into any county and begin to really understand which places need what kind of support to kickstart or keep recovery going. Here, a focus on several zip codes would target the most impacted and distressed areas in this county. Even more specifically for Transylvania County, focusing on Brevard, specific zip code 28708, or Rosman, zip codes 28722 and 28712, would put your often limited disaster recovery funds into the right areas based on what we currently know about this disaster. Wrapping up this section, I wanted to take one more moment of your time and touch on some of the key takeaways. First, I think it's imperative to ensure that losses are correctly accounted for, and that means trying to get as many people to apply for FEMA as possible. We all know anecdotally where the damage was, but if FEMA does not put their eyes on it through the right program, it does not exist and will not be counted. Second, targeting recovery efforts based on sound science, like social vulnerability, is a critical step in building sound recovery programs. Finally, without a focus on the most impacted and distressed areas, you will likely simply see people moving away. The most vulnerable in our society need help to kick off and sustain recovery. Without it, they will be unable to have successful recovery. And with that, I will like to thank you and remember that a complete accounting of preliminary impacts and unmet needs, as well as a ton more about the disaster itself, will be covered in next week's Regional Recovery Acceleration Week. And I think I'm passing it over to Josh for a bit more information. Josh?
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you, Chris and Matt. Your partnership and ongoing work is much appreciated. Everyone, my name is Joshua Bryant, and I serve as a disaster recovery advisor here at SBP. Before joining SBP, I served as the recovery division chief for the Texas Division of Emergency Management, where I managed multiple disasters, assessing damages, securing federal funds, and a multi-billion-dollar recovery program for Texas. SPP's advice team consists of people who have served in similar roles, previously leading disaster recovery efforts at state and local levels, and many of us have learned a lot of hard lessons. This is why our team is committed to sharing knowledge that empowers state and local government leaders to provide fast, predictable, and equitable recovery assistance to disaster survivors everywhere. Today, I'm going to brief you all on three things. First, common challenges that government leaders face following a disaster. Second, recommendations to address these challenges. And then finally, examples of different ways that SPP is currently engaging with government partners in Western North Carolina. Beginning with challenges, there are a few traditional pitfalls that delay and disrupt recovery efforts, and we advise local and state leaders to be aware of these to help retain public trust and advance recovery programs. The first pitfall is that disaster recovery programs can be complex. And the first thing, and probably one of the most important things to do, is to be able to navigate this program successfully, is ensuring that your community is meeting deadlines or understanding the process of how to meet the federal deadlines that are established through FEMA or HUD programs. Missing process steps or missing deadlines will result in a loss of eligibility for assistance, may result in additional paperwork, and often limits critical access to resources or funding. Next, communities often fail to leverage all of the different sources of funding following a disaster. This may be due to a lack of awareness, complicated requirements, staffing constraints, or many other things. Maximizing available resources helps ensure comprehensive recovery efforts, reduces dependencies on a single source, and helps meet the unique needs of a community following a disaster. And then the last pitfall is communities must follow a very specific standard and specific regulations when receiving and using federal grants to reimburse disaster recovery costs. State entities are responsible for administering and passing through recovery funds from the federal government, and they must ensure that their programs are in compliance with federal law, rule, regulation, and policy. These challenges and pitfalls arise when local governments are required to return funds because they miss or overlook a specific requirement. For example, failure to follow procurement requirements outlined in 2 CFR Part 200 is a leading cause of deobligations, recoupments of federal funds, and often these rules are not broken intentionally, but non-competitive procurement practices or inadequate documentation can lead to audit findings or require the return of funds. And from our past experience, nothing will derail a community's recovery efforts faster than losing eligible costs due to an oversight or a misunderstanding of federal rules or regulations. To help avoid these pitfalls, SPP's advice team teaches best practices and lessons learned from our previous experiences. The following that I'm about to brief you on are things that we really push to local leaders to help them retain public trust and maintain momentum as they move through their recovery efforts. The first recommendation is that local leaders must internalize and understand that every disaster begins, ends, and is managed at the local level. This is where the greatest number of hurdles, challenges, and demands will occur, and we advise government partners to build a team of experts and community stakeholders to develop recovery goals and to help local officials navigate recovery programs by learning the administrative rules, learning the allowances, learning the deadlines, and learning the process. Our next recommendation is to regularly communicate expectations, successes, and program progress. This helps recovery teams build momentum and gain community trust. For example, leaders should consistently encourage disaster survivors to apply for FEMA individual assistance and then to appeal any determinations that they disagree with, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in today's webinar. As mentioned by Dr. Emmerich, high participation in these programs not only helps survivors in need, but survivor registration and reported unmet needs is critical and impacts future disaster recovery appropriations. Local leaders should encourage disaster impacted citizens to report their damages, and then local leaders can also track survivor registrations on a regular basis in their community leading up to established deadlines. Next, document everything. And this applies to both government entities, private nonprofit organizations, and disaster survivors themselves. Maintaining meticulous records of all expenses, damage assessments, and recovery actions related to federal funding is crucial for eligibility determination, audit purposes, and ensuring compliance with federal regulations. This documentation also serves as the best protection against deobligations and recoupments of federal funds, regardless of the recovery source. And then our final recommendation is to leverage all available funding to the best of your ability. In my experience, specifically in the FEMA Public Assistance Program, applicants often fail to take advantage of tools such as management and administrative funds, hazard mitigation improvements to damaged facilities, or public assistance appeal rights. And then finally, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the different ways that SBP's advice team is currently engaged by supporting North Carolina government entities and community organizations to help implement these best practices and lessons learned. Our current support includes ongoing technical assistance, just-in-time training, and advice at multiple levels of government and to private nonprofit organizations, focusing on FEMA's programs like the FEMA Public Assistance Program and individual assistance programs, as well as long-term recovery planning. Next, in partnership with the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency and the Housing Assistance Corporation of Henderson County, SBP will be conducting a disaster housing course on December 12th and 13th of next week. This course will focus on construction policies, effective damage assessments, and contracting outcomes. Additionally, in partnership with North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, SBP will be facilitating a disaster case management training sometime in January of 2025. This training will help prepare caseworkers to assess survivor needs, develop personalized recovery plans, and then coordinate resources and services. And then finally, SBP will facilitate something we call a Regional Recovery Acceleration Week on December 10th and 11th. During the Regional Recovery Acceleration Week, SBP will share Hurricane Helene UTMED needs assessments, disaster recovery best practices, lessons learned with elected officials and leaders from area foundations, and nonprofit organizations to ensure prompt, efficient, and predictable recovery in the aftermath of disaster. I would like to take a second to thank our local partner, the Housing Assistance Corporation of Henderson County, and our corporate sponsors, AT&T and Farmers Insurance, who I believe have joined us on today's call. And we are excited to be hosting this event with you all next week. Also, for the attendees, there is a QR code on the screen. This QR code will take you to a registration link for the Regional Recovery Acceleration Week. And I encourage you all to share this with your local contacts in the disaster impacted area so they can join us if they're available. More information about this will be discussed at the end of today's webinar. But please, if you know somebody who may benefit from this type of training, please pass them our way. I'll now pass the briefing to Angela Calabro, who leads our SBP Share program, to talk more about opportunities.
Hi all, and thanks Josh. Glad to see familiar names joining us today and grateful to all the new folks joining us as well. As Josh said, my name is Angela Calabro. I'm the Share Program Director, which means that I manage our nonprofit partnerships program. That's where we connect with local nonprofits across the country to share SBP's best practices, training, and even AmeriCorps members to help increase the capacity of the nonprofit sector post-disaster. In addition to our resource sharing services, I also worked closely with partners in Eastern Kentucky after the February 21 and then catastrophic July 22 floods, where we also provided a Regional Recovery Acceleration Week, as Josh mentioned. But critically, it's also where we learned so much from them and our partners there about the challenges of rebuilding in Appalachia. So before I get into the agenda, I just wanted to start off with a note that this webinar is really the beginning of a conversation. Our hope is that the information that we're providing today really ripples from you to your partners, your networks, and other community leaders that you work with. So in this section, I'll go through considerations to be made for home repair and future mitigation, the importance of FEMA, and the Regional Recovery Acceleration Week. So let's get to it. I know I don't have to tell you all of this, but I really want to hone in on the idea that while a lot of these homes are older and are open to being repaired right now, it's really the time to include resiliency and mitigation measures into the construction that we're providing. Excuse me. You can see on this slide here, it shows the high percentage of homes in Buncombe and Henderson counties that were built pre-1978. And with this older housing stock means there will be more expensive, it will be more expensive to update those utilities and bring those homes up to code, especially with a high percentage of these homes having lead, asbestos, and very likely deferred maintenance. So with all of that, we want to encourage you to consider the cost analysis of building new versus making repairs to the existing structures. We also know that the best way to keep our residents safe is by elevating and relocating. Both of these come with their own set of challenges. Elevating an older home can be expensive as older homes tend to separate and maybe split as they're being lifted. Relocation has its own set of challenges. We know many of the families have been on this land for generations and may not want to leave their ancestral land. And even if they do want to relocate, they might not be able to afford to do so. So with all of that, what resilient measures outside of elevation and relocation can we consider to ensure that the construction done in our communities today builds back more resiliently? Items such as flood-resistant flooring and drywall, even flood vents as appropriate, elevated utilities and electrical systems, and even mitigating the landscape around the home to move water away from the home structure. Lastly, as Dr. Emmerich said earlier, it's really critical that we prioritize the most vulnerable populations who won't be served elsewhere. There will be a finite amount of resources available, such as funding, support, staff, and even federal dollars over the years to come. So how can we make sure as the social services sector that we're working together to ensure the most vulnerable and high-risk populations are supported and prioritized versus providing services on a first come, first served basis? We know that often those who receive services first are often able to do so because they have the access and resources to have already identified those services. So it's really critical that we support our most at-risk populations. Moving to the next slide, thank you. FEMA. So there's a lot of feelings with FEMA. We have seen them do incredible work. We've also seen them really miss the mark in communities. But what's really integral to FEMA being able to provide support is the local social services sector, all of us coming together and taking on the responsibility of encouraging and translating the importance of FEMA to our impacted residents. So how can we do that? We can do that first by encouraging and educating folks on the importance of working with FEMA and understanding, as Dr. Emmerich also said, that FEMA is not meant to return homes back to how they were before. FEMA is only, very critically, only meant to provide safe and sanitary conditions back, not to put homes back to the whole condition that they were before. I've also noted on the slide here that FEMA has granted an extension for applications to be submitted. The new deadline for initial applications is going to be January 7th, 25. So keep that in mind as we're talking to folks. Another important note is that FEMA is able to grant up to $42,500 in home repairs and replacement costs. The same amount is available for other needs assistance. Other needs assistance includes items such as personal property, transportation, moving, and storage. While impacted residents can access up to total amount of $85,000 from FEMA, initial awards are typically much lower at around $10,000 for initial awards. To that end, it's critically important that we encourage people to appeal. Consider how you and your network can help encourage people to do just that. We've all heard the heartbreaking stories of someone receiving $750 in FEMA awards and giving up. So how can we help them understand that more money is possible? One of the ways we can do this is by getting the word out. Radio, news ads, Facebook, wherever people are getting their information from, we want to be going to them with this information. So some examples of why this is so important: on the micro individual level, even if a homeowner only has damage to their crawl space and they go and they clean it out using bleach today, believing that's fine. In 5 or 6 months, when the summer rolls in and mold begins to grow back, they will no longer be eligible for FEMA appeals or federal support. But if they apply to FEMA before the application deadline of, what did I say, January 7th, and receive a registration number, they could then appeal later on for additional assistance. So now on the macro community level, if a community does not receive now the amount of money that they need, when our federal assistance dollars comes out down the line, there's a direct correspondence there. So let me say that again plainly. Very critically, the more money that comes to your community now through FEMA, the more money is going to come to your community down the road from the federal government. So that's why it's so critically important that the community and FEMA appeals and assistance is provided at the highest level possible now, so that years down the road, you're getting the most money from the federal government as possible. So how can SBP help? Right now, SBP is providing appeal assistance in Western North Carolina. Homeowners are currently able to reach out to us and request appeal assistance in 3 major areas: home repair, personal property, and moving and storage assistance. Next, SBP's Disaster Assistance Program is also able to provide training to help demystify the language that FEMA uses for any nonprofit or organization who interfaces with impacted individuals. So if you or your network knows organizations that are working and speaking to impacted residents, this is a really great opportunity to train them on that language. Third point here, our team is also going to be out at the Regional Recovery Acceleration Week next week, providing that training in person. If you can't make it, totally fine. Please reach out and let us know, and we'll try to schedule an individualized session for you and your organization at another time that's better. And lastly, for nonprofits, businesses, houses of worship that are on this call or in your network, the Small Business Administration and FEMA Public Assistance may be available to help. They do have really excellent programs in both of those organizations that might be able to help. My colleague Josh Bryant, who you heard from earlier, and his team, the Advise team, can provide more information about that. So please reach out to us if you'd like more information about how to apply. And moving on to the last slide. My last slide here, I wanted to just provide a little bit more information about the in-person event next week. Josh already went into it, but what you're seeing here is just the cross-section of what we're going to go into a bit more deeply next week. We'd love for you to invite, I know the QR code is in the chat, so we'd love for you to join us. We'd love for you to invite others who you think would benefit from this. And for those of you who can't be convinced to come out for the free lunch and coffee and snacks, please reach out to me. We'd love to set up some other time to work with your organization. Lastly, my contact information is going to be on the last slide here. And so if you just want to keep the conversation going, please reach out again. I'd love to set up a time to connect. And with that, I'll pass it to Thomas Corley.
Thank you, Angela. And just to reiterate something that Angela said here, y'all, like this is the start of a conversation. And I want to thank Angela and Josh and Matt and Dr. Emmerich for sharing a bit of information today. But there's a lot that we've shared here. And again, our intention is to try and pay forward as much of our understanding and experience as we can to offer guidance, to offer sort of a light to shine the way towards a shortened recovery. And so with just a few minutes left here, our team's happy to answer some questions, and I know Elizabeth Egley has a few of those lined up. I just want to reiterate a few things that you've heard a couple of times already. One is our Regional Recovery Acceleration Week. That's going to run next week. If you're interested in attending, there's the QR code, or Angela will be in town, Josh will be in town, Elizabeth Egley will be in town. If you'd like to sit down and talk more deeply about some of what we've shared here, please reach out to us. We'd love to connect. There's some upcoming deadlines for FEMA and SBA. You can see those on the slide here. There's, as we get into the holidays and the craziness that is the end of the year, compounded with the continued recovery efforts for Helene, we want to make sure that community understands those superimposed deadlines. And then finally, SBP, we're still seeking to grow our partnership and our impact across Western North Carolina. Over the next couple of weeks, we really will continue to meet with government and nonprofit leaders to understand how SBP can best support and be an accelerant for recovery in the region. Part of what's going to dictate what SBP can do and frankly, where we should do it is going to be informed by the conversations we're going to have in the coming weeks. And so we'll be excited to share more about those developments, our impact model, our thoughts on how we can best support from a community-centric perspective, the recovery and the road ahead in Western North Carolina. And so more to come here. And then finally, you've got contact information. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us. We'd love to talk a little bit more about what we're seeing and how we hope to support the long-term recovery efforts in Western North Carolina. And so with all of this and with just a few minutes to spare here, Elizabeth, are there some questions that you'd like this group to answer?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for these really great questions. I'm going to give 2 of the FEMA related ones to Josh, and then we'll get to a couple more. So first, Josh, when will the FEMA impact data by county be available? And can you also answer a question about undocumented folks? Will they be left uncounted or risk detention and deportation? Please answer this not as a political question, but as a real concern of millions of workers and survivors. What do you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. Starting with the FEMA data question. So the short answer is FEMA does have publicly available data on their website, which is Open FEMA Datasets, which updates approximately weekly by program, meaning like individual assistance program, public assistance program, and other programs that FEMA offers. That outlines impacts that do not include personally identified information. There are data sets that are available to local leaders that have information sharing agreements that may provide more regular updates or more detailed information, but you can gauge impacts by counties by looking at FEMA's open data set. And if the person that asked that question would like to explore that more deeply, feel free to shoot me an email and I'm happy to jump on a call and walk you through how to navigate those data sets specifically. To the citizenship question. So according to FEMA's policy guides, individuals that are eligible for the FEMA Individuals and Households Program, which is the primary program offered under the Individual Assistance Program, either must be a U.S. citizen, a non-citizen national, or a qualified alien. If you do not meet any of these specific categorical qualifications, but another adult member of your household meets the eligibility criteria, you may still apply for FEMA individual assistance. Or if you are the parent or guardian of a minor child who is a U.S. citizen that is under 18 at the time of the disaster, that household still qualifies for FEMA's programs. Regarding the question about deportation, FEMA doesn't address this in policy, but they put out a press release in October for the Helene disaster. And their press release states that FEMA will not proactively provide applicant information to immigrant or law enforcement organizations. And so I would say this not written that there's no risk at all, but FEMA stating that that should not be a concern to individuals who are seeking assistance through FEMA programs. And then finally, FEMA does offer certain social service programs like crisis counseling that any individual that needs it qualifies for. And so you do not have to qualify for the Individuals and Households Program specifically to receive some of the social service opportunities like crisis counseling that's available under FEMA's programs.
Thank you, Josh. And Thomas, I have this really great question that came in about the state's recovery and housing plan being powered mostly by federal funding. And we all know that HUD dollars and federal dollars can take years to hit the ground. So what's going to happen until then?
It's a great question, and we could take a few moments here really to unpack it. I'll be brief and then again, happy to connect. It's a great question. Simply, this is where philanthropy, this is where nonprofit partners really need to step up and fill that gap. I will say we at SVP are deeply energized and inspired at the pacing and the sense of urgency that we're feeling through the state of North Carolina and through Matt's team. There's a deep desire to deliver these dollars as quickly as possible. And yet still, there will be that gap in time where it will take a moment for these funds to arrive, be mobilized, and hit homeowners and hit vulnerable populations. And so in between that space, this is where nonprofits, volunteers, and response groups really shine and help to attend to the most critical needs, get people secure and sustained until those federal monies do hit communities. And so SVP has a number of programs that seek to reduce that amount of time and get those federal dollars to communities faster, and also operationalize around that gap moment where there aren't funds. So again, we'd love to talk a little bit more about what that looks like and how kind of seeing this experience and feeling it on behalf of homeowners time and time again, how it's informed our mission, how it's informed our advisory services. But we'll save that for another moment and just appreciate the question.
Thanks, Thomas. To the person who asked about having this material available, we will be emailing this deck to anybody on the call after the call. And then for the person who asked about if we'll have other RAW events, yes, we plan on having multiple trainings in 2025, but if you're from an area outside of Western North Carolina and are interested, we want to hear from you. So please be in touch with us. Angela, I have a question for you. Wondering if there are outreaches specifically to Spanish dominant communities in Western North Carolina. Can you talk maybe a little bit about how DAP is doing that?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. That's a great question. I know that from the DAP, which is our disaster assistance program, that was the program I mentioned that really supports our appeals and applications and getting those numbers up as high as possible. That program, as well as my SHARE program, which provides the training and best practices that I mentioned earlier, we're working with a group called Colaborativa La Milpa, and they're based and focused in the Emma community in Buncombe County. They're doing great work. They're a grassroots collaborative of smaller and like grassroots NGOs in the area that come together to make sure resources are shared, specifically like disaster resources in Spanish dominant communities. So I'm not sure who asked that question, but feel free to reach out and I can either connect you with that Colaborativa La Milpa, or we can just talk about what resources we have available in Spanish. Thanks.
Thank you. And just one more question for everybody is, can you be more specific about who should attend RAW, the Regional Recovery Acceleration Week? I think I'm looking at Josh for that one.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So primarily, I would say local government leaders or community leaders that would influence disaster recovery in some way in their community. And I know that's pretty broad, but if you feel like your organization is a decision maker in the disaster recovery process, and you're either applying for federal funding or you have a constituency that is applying for federal funding, it would benefit your leadership team to participate in RAW. That way you understand the scope of the disaster, some of the programs that are available from the federal level, and then some of the programs that are available to assist the citizenships that you have some kind of responsibility over. And so very broadly, anyone that could be a decision maker would greatly benefit from RAW.
Great. Okay, we've gone over time. Lots of really great material. Thank you to our presenters, and really thanks to everyone who joined us today for this beginning of the conversation. We want to hear from you, so please be in touch. Have a great rest of your week.